All right.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Wolf, Executive Director of Mountaintop Arboretum, and I am very delighted that we are presenting Attracting Beneficial Insects to Your Garden with Claudia Vispo and Conrad Vispo. Conrad Vispo, a wildlife biologist, and Claudia Vispo, a botanist, are researchers and educators with the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology program in Columbia County. Together with their colleagues, they document the wild plants and animals of their county and beyond, and are particularly interested in the synergies between wild nature and agriculture. They are conducting experimental on-farm research at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Hurley to explore how farms might better support regional biodiversity and in turn receive more benefits from wild nature. At Hawthorne Valley Farm, they manage a native plant garden, butterfly house, and beneficial habitats. They also offer free ecology walks and other educational programming and conduct biodiversity surveys on private and public lands. They've also worked with the Arboretum on our natural resources inventory, and so we know them well, and we're delighted that they are presenting today. They studied bats and butterflies and moths and odonats. Conrad, you let me know if there's more.
I think that
was it. They have no formal training as landscape architects or gardeners, but got drawn into the practical work of native plant gardening because of their desire to demonstrate examples of insect-friendly habitats that can be created in our backyards and on farms. So some logistics before we start. The talk is going to be about 45 minutes, and I can pose questions during, but anything we don't ask, we can ask again at the end, or I can pose a question at the end. If you have technical difficulties, use the chat room for that, which Ryan, the Arboretum's horticulturist, is monitoring, and I will monitor the Q&A. So if you have questions, put them to the Q&A box. Please check our website for upcoming programs. This webinar is free. If you'd like to make a suggested donation, which goes directly back into our programming, please visit the support page on our website, mtarboretum.org. And now I will turn it over to Claudia and Conrad. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And good morning to everybody. Oops. Do you guys hear an echo?
No.
Okay, good. So I'm delighted to, or we are delighted to share with you some of our thoughts today about how to attract beneficial insects to your garden. And the outline of the presentation is we'll give a little bit of our background. Then Conrad will speak about why worry about insects and his thoughts about what is a beneficial insect anyway. And then I will come back and share some of my practical suggestions of how to create a garden full of life, and we'll finish up with final thoughts. So our background, where we are coming from, we are working with the Hawthorne Valley Farmscape Ecology program in the heart of Columbia County. This is our home farm. And some of the experience that we're bringing to this presentation today is 20 years of biodiversity surveys in wild and managed habitats throughout Columbia County and beyond. More than 10 years now of native plant garden around our program's building at Hawthorne Valley. A study that was comparing landscaped meadows and goldenrod dominated old fields for their utility for insects. And descriptive and experimental on-farm research to document the interactions between wild nature and farming, including the creation of beneficial on-farm habitats. And I just want to show you some of the examples of the projects we are involved with. So at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub in Hurley, just down the mountain from Mountaintop Arboretum, we have the opportunity to experiment with native meadows, and we will speak about that in a little bit more detail later. We're also involved with rewilding former farmed wetland at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. At the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and Hawthorne Valley Farm, we have created beetle banks And we're creating and managing perennial pollinator borders on the vegetable fields here at Hawthorne Valley Farm. And finally, we are running the native plant garden at the Creek House, which I will also speak more about later on. So I'll pass it over to Conrad, who will talk about why worry about insects.
Why worry in general? I just want to say thanks to the MTA for having us. I'm really sorry that we're not actually up there physically. For those of you who have not been to the Mountaintop Arboretum, it's a beautiful place. And I can just imagine it's buzzing with insects today as our backyard is. Yeah, so just wanted to share a little bit about why I care about insects. And I think probably if you're here, you already care about them, but this is a little bit of our perspective on life. Part of it is just that the insects are members of the Earth's arc of life. And if one respects the Earth, one respects insects. Obviously, they're deeply interconnected with the rest of life, and their changes in abundance and diversity will affect us and many other creatures. While the evidence is probably complex, there's good indication that they're actually declining substantially, at least in some regions. And I'll spend a bit of time going over that and describing a little bit of that work. And finally, probably a lot of the reason for that decline are some of our own actions. So a little bit of our philosophy, where we come from, you can try to evaluate biodiversity or insects from an economic utilitarian perspective, and that's useful at times, important at times, but often it sort of masks this. We try to use those figures as a way to excuse the loves that we're a little bit embarrassed of, or clothe those things that we're not so proud of. So I think it comes down to insects do interact with us. They do have economic relationships, etc. But really, if there's not the simple love and respect underlying our responses to insects, then I think quantification won't save either insects or us. So just a little bit more of those reasons about why insects are important. And I think this is a type of food web you're probably all pretty aware of. This was actually some work done in Great Britain, looking at a farm in Great Britain, and these green dots along the center there are actually some of the crop plants, and you can just see how many different things are interconnected, and many of those things are insects. So if you were to lose some of those, you would certainly have a lot of ripple effects. So I think perhaps some of us became most aware of insect declines in 2017, 2018. This is an article from the New York Times, which seemed to be a little bit of a catalyst. Of course, before that, many people were concerned about pollinators. Conservationists had been realizing moths were declining. It wasn't news in some ways, but I think it really reached the public with something like this article. And I want to explore a little bit the reasons or the evidence behind that, because it gives you a little bit of an insight into insects themselves and a little bit of a background on where the case for insect declines come from. So really one of the papers that got this off the ground and really started to renew interest in insect declines came from Crayfield. Or Claudia can say it better than I can. There we go. There's the translation. The Malaise trap study. So Malaise traps are, you see one of these down here, they're little tents that intercept flying insects. And this work had been going on since the 90s. And the researchers published it in, I believe, 2017. And here is a diagram showing the results. This is a little bit complicated, but it's also a little bit neat. Along the vertical axis, it shows biomass. Note that that's a log scale. So if you go between 1 and 10, you've declined 90%. And then along the bottom is month of the year. And then the colors actually show the years, with the darker colors being the earlier years and the lighter colors being the later years. And what you see is that, yes, we have very few insects in April, and they get to be abundant midsummer and then they decline. But most of those orange yellowy dots are well underneath the darker dots. And they actually estimated that there was about a 75% decline over 27 years in the biomass of insects that they were catching. Another study that got popular attention at that time was a 2018 publication from Puerto Rico, looking at the Luquillo Experimental Forest Reserve in eastern Puerto Rico. And what they reported was that comparing results of, I think this was sweep netting in January 1976, 1977 to 2011, 2012, and 2013, they saw huge declines or registered huge declines in biomass and reported ripple effects through the rainforest food web. So those two articles were some of the ones that really got popular interest, galvanated. But things start to get complicated. So this is a recent 2021 paper that came out responding to that paper on Luquillo. And they say arthropod abundances are not generally declining in that forest. And it does not appear to be in response to warming. They certainly do not poo-poo the idea that there are major biodiversity declines, but they're critical a little bit of that paper. And I think that just serves to indicate that caution, life is complicated. This is ecology, and it's really hard to pick out some of these trends and some of these patterns. And this is just our own data. And if any of you see a trend in that data, please let me know, because I don't see it. But this is our attempt to do some standardized insect monitoring. We actually began in 2016. This is in Hurley. And each of those different colors is a different insect group. And you can see how much variation there is year to year in the abundance of those insects. And really, it just typifies the fact that if you want to get trends, you're going to need to have many years of data. So looking at a little bit more at what has been published, this is some work that reviewed insects and just classified them as freshwater or terrestrial. And it looks at along the vertical axis, you've got different geographic locations. Across the bottom here, you have whether the trends in the population are negative on the left of 0 or positive on the right of 0. The blue indicates freshwater invertebrates and the brown indicates terrestrial invertebrates. And not every location has both. But the basic points I want to make here are there's a lot of geographic variation. So if you compare, for example, the fate of terrestrial insects in Germany, it's noticeably lower than, say, that in the Northwest in Russia. I'm sorry, that was aquatic insects. But if you compare it to, say, the rest of Northern Europe, you can see that the terrestrial insects are suffering more in Germany than elsewhere in Europe. And the other thing is, if you look in general, the freshwater insects are doing better than the terrestrial insects. That's thought to reflect the fact that a lot of clean water management techniques have come into being. So looking a little bit more, this is sort of the same idea, but this is just a map form of that. This are the number of species, the number of butterfly species that are red book listed, in other words, are considered rare in these various countries of Europe. And basically, again, you see some countries are doing relatively well, some are doing not so well. Now, there's a little bit of complication here because not all countries monitor this the same way. Some countries are smaller than others, but the authors did feel that this was reflective, at least to some degree, of the variation in the fates of butterflies across Europe. And this is just some work showing that indeed the patterns that you see amongst different kinds of insects are not constant. So not only do you have variation across geography, you've got variation across insect groups. And here on the left, you've just got 5 different species or 5 different orders of insects, the beetles, the ants and their relatives, the butterflies, dragonfly-ish sort of things, and grasshoppers and their kin. And globally, this shows you the percent of insect species which are being followed, which are declining. So the poor grasshoppers are really suffering. About 30% of the Lepidoptera, that's butterflies and moths, are declining. And then if you look over here, this happens to be for the UK, and it just shows you sort of the rate of decline for those insects which in the UK are declining. So, about, say about 10% of the moths and butterflies in the United Kingdom are declining very substantially, 40% decrease over 40 years. So in other words, you don't need to memorize all this, but it just shows you the variation amongst the fates of different insect groups. And then to go back to that idea of geography a little bit, this is some work just from Great Britain. And what it shows is the trends in moths. And if you look at Great Britain as a whole, moth abundances are decreasing. But then if you split Great Britain into North and South, you see that most of that is accounted for by the decline. Essentially, all of it is accounted for by the decline in the southern, more industrial, more heavily settled parts of Great Britain. Whereas in the north, including Scotland, you actually have, if anything, an increase in the moths. So it's complicated. This is a map showing changes in bumblebee diversity across the United States. The redder colors indicate a decrease, more and more dramatic decreases. And what you see again is that while I'd certainly say that butterfly species richness or diversity has decreased over North America as a whole, that patterning is not consistent. There are places where it has actually increased. And then this is sort of the same type of thing, different ways you can look at the United States. This is butterfly abundance trends, blue being positive butterfly population trends, the red being negative, and what you see is the Southwest essentially looks like it's burning. And one of the reasons why it's believed there is such sharp decline in the Southwest is because climate change is really increasing the drought frequency and intensity in that region, and that has a very negative effect on butterflies. And then I just wanted to sort of bring this a little bit closer to home. The data are not so good in some ways, but at least we have more in the region. These are beetle captures at Hubbard Brook. They had a special type of trap that they were using to catch beetles that were flying through. And that's just the vertical axis is just mean number of beetles captured in 48 hours. And it compares 1970s to the current decade and shows substantial declines. Now, there's not a great deal of data in this paper. I think they did a good job with what they had, but I think I would want to see more data before I stood up on a soapbox and said too much about this. But it does indicate, again, that some of these patterns we're seeing globally might be happening more regionally. And then this is butterflies in Ohio. They estimated about a 33% decline in Ohio butterflies. But then I just want to end this little review of insect fate by looking at these diagrams from NABA. And NABA is the North American Butterfly Association. And if you are interested, this is all available online at however you want to say it. It could be Web Butterfly, or it could be We Butterfly. But anyway, at this site. And these are just the population trends based on their 4th of July counts in New York State. And I would say I don't see discrete trends. You have some butterflies, such as the European skipper, which is actually an introduced species, which seem to have declined. That's the 4th one down, seems to have declined dramatically in some recent years. But then you have other ones like the meadow fritillary, which according to this might be getting a little bit more common. And if you look at other species, you just see them bouncing around. Now, there may be some subtle trends hidden in there, but the point again is the fates of different species do not all move in tandem. And New York State I would say, is not doing obviously badly. And who knows what's happening around MTA and in the Catskills and over here in the Tectonics. So in sum, It's messy. Trends tend to vary over geographies and insect groups, but there does seem to be the fairly good evidence that there are declines happening. It's not clear if that's happening in our region. And if you love insects, then you should think perhaps about how your gardens and other activities can help support them. This, by the way, this butterfly on here is an early hair streak taken up at MTA, a picture taken at MTA, a beautiful little butterfly sitting on these forget-me-nots. You see, I had to check Claudia just to make sure I wasn't mislabeling that or misclaiming that flower. But that, yeah, it's an unusual butterfly to see, and it should be flying shortly. Nice to see that. So what are the stressors that are likely affecting insect populations, and sort of by extension, what can we do about it? Certainly climate change, as I mentioned, is affecting insect populations. Introduced species, for example, the silk moths have probably declined substantially because of the species introduced to control the gypsy moth, which has not really controlled the gypsy moth probably all that substantially, but has really impacted some of our native silk moth populations. Residential and commercial development, causing habitat loss, light pollution, etc. Ag intensification, habitat loss, pesticide use are all important factors. And I'm going to concentrate probably a little bit more on the residential commercial development, just because I'm assuming, although I don't know the audience that is listening right now at all, I'm assuming that most of you probably come from that line. And just to kind of emphasize, this is an image from a recent paper by David Wagner, and it just, as he calls it, death by 1,000 cuts. Basically, if you think about insect fate, there's unfortunately, no single smoking gun that you can just say, oh, if we fix that, everything will be dandy. Not surprisingly, because if you think about all the effects that human activity is having on the globe, you're creating a multitude of stressors, and insects are responding to all of those stressors, and they're certainly interacting. So thinking a little bit about the consequences of residential development and insect populations more deeply, this is a map showing the use of pesticides in New York State in pounds in 2017. And the gray indicates the highest levels of use, and that goes to green being lowest. And I don't think there's actually any black on there. But one of the things you can kind of notice immediately is that it doesn't necessarily parallel agricultural activity. So Westchester County and Dutchess County, and Long Island, which are showing the most intense use of pesticides, that gray is the most intense, are not known as huge agricultural powerhouses in New York State. I mean, obviously there's a little bit of there's some agriculture. Likewise, Albany County, Saratoga County. So what's actually driving some of this, some of it is agricultural, no doubt, but some of it, and much of it, is actually residential pesticide use. This is for lawns, for home gardens, for pest control in houses, that sort of thing. So I think that's an important thing to be conscious of, that we are all responsible in a way for the proliferation of pesticide use. Another aspect of residential development and commercial development is light pollution. And this is an image of the southern New England, southeastern New York State, showing the lights at night in 2012. And one of the reasons that we even bring this up is it's becoming clearer and clearer that light pollution is probably having an effect on our insects. Moths, their purpose in life is not to flutter around street lamps. Their purpose in life is to mate and lay eggs and that sort of thing. And as they get distracted, that can have consequences for their populations. Another aspect of residential development is habitat loss. And this is where I am finally getting to gardens. These are two images showing Austerlitz in Columbia County. That happens to be where we are. That's why I'm showing this. It's the same area. in 1971. You can see there are some nice blocks of unbroken forest here, whereas that same area by 2019 is scattered, is sort of a Swiss cheese of housing openings and forest. And I think as you consider your garden and its ecological role, these forest openings can replicate, your lawn can replicate a forest gap, which insects love. They need those forest openings, and they occurred naturally, and we have controlled them somewhat by controlling fire and flooding. But those lawns could also be ecological traps. So let me just explain a little bit more what I mean. Here are some natural forest openings, and what you see is that actually life responds to those openings. This is some work we did in floodplain forests in Columbia County. The stream would be over here on the left. And then and up here, it shows you how open the canopy is. Down here on the bottom, it's the amount of herbaceous cover. And then these symbols show you where insect life was, because we did trapping for insects, these little drawings. And then the colored symbols in here are herbaceous plant life. And basically what we see is where there are openings in the canopy, you have a flourishing of insects and herbaceous life. And then where the forest is more closed, you have less of that. You need the closed forest, but the insects also and the plants also depend on these openings. And so are you creating openings like that the plants and the insects will celebrate, or are you creating something like this, which would be an ecological trap? And what an ecological trap means is it's something that attracts an organism like an insect, but then actually hurts it. So, for example, these are chrysanthemums. They look beautiful. The colors could certainly attract insects, but they're not producing any nectar or pollen for the insects. And so the insects will come over, expend their energy flying futilely around and not get something out of it. So it really, there are other examples of this. You could say if, for example, you had lots of flowers in your garden and then you sprayed that garden with pesticide, that would be an ecological. So are you providing nectar and even perhaps better specialized resources needed by plant predators? And when I say plant predators, I mean insects that are actually eating the plant, be it the leaves or the pollen. In this case, this is a native bee that is closely tied, or probably, I can't tell for sure with the species, but there is a species, this is spring beauty. There is a species of spring bee that frequents spring beauty and really relies on the pollen, to some degree the nectar of spring beauty, and is tied to that plant. Likewise, something like a monarch is very much tied to milkweed. This is not milkweed, but the caterpillars would be on milkweed. So I'm going to close by just talking a little bit about what is a beneficial insect. That was in our title. And I think, what's a beneficial and who makes the call? So if you're an organic farmer, you probably consider, or a farmer of any sort, you probably consider insects that improve soil, like dung beetles or pollinators of crops, or the parasitoid wasps, like you see down here on the right. If any of you, this is where I'd ask any of you, if you're gardeners, if you recognize this pest. It's a flea beetle, which is a real bane of those of you trying to raise brassicas, the mustard family. So if you're an organic farmer, you might consider these to be beneficials, but it's complicated. This happens to be a ground beetle that's, in this case, feeding on weed seeds, hence it's a beneficial, but the same species of ground beetle will run out and go after strawberries, hence it's a pest. And so you realize that these terms are relative. If you're a gardener, you probably think of beneficial insects as these butterflies. Now, if you're a farmer, some of those butterflies actually will eat your crops, for the caterpillars at least. So again, that doesn't mean that you're right or wrong in calling this a beneficial, it's just you have an opinion. If you're a conservationist, you might like something like this, which is a burying beetle, which loves to eat dead mammals and birds. This is the American burying beetle, which is actually an endangered species. So your perspective on what's a beneficial or what is a beneficial insect will vary. If you're a bat, you'll like whatever insects are yummy. If you're a trillium, you'd like the ants, which carry your seeds. So trillium actually has these little waxy, fatty additions to their seeds. The ants pick them up and they take them back to the nest. They eat these little attachments, bury the seeds, and lo and behold, you get trillium. So if you're a trillium, that might be, you might think ants are beneficial. So the bottom line is, I think what's a beneficial is in the eye of the beholder. And now if you all look at this photograph carefully, what you see is there's actually a crab spider nestled in this flower that's eating a bee. So bees are beneficial. So does that mean a crab spider is a pest? Well, no, because crab spiders eat some pests. Anyway, it gets and to me or to us, beneficial isn't always a useful stereotype for insects, but if your garden can support native species, then it's being beneficial. So lastly, I just sort of want to give a word of caution that if you want to support native insects, it's not going to come necessarily without some costs in a way, whether that's because some of the native insects or native creatures that come in a wilder place like ticks, wasps, spiders, only wasps that are actually insects, but might make you feel uncomfortable, or because, you know, if you're providing food to the insects, they're going to be eating those plants, and you might end up with plants looking not quite as hale and hardy as you might wish. But taking this approach also comes with wondrous rewards that you can follow, such as the butterflies and bees in this photograph. So I hope that's a little bit of background, and I'll pass it over to Claudia.
Thank you. All right, and I'll finish out this presentation with some practical suggestions how to create a garden full of life. And my first suggestion is to start learning what is already there and what the potential is of your site to support more life. And as an example, I want to show you the Creek House garden. When we moved our program into the Creek House 10 years ago, we had half an acre of former residential land around it that had not been maintained for a few years. And we just started out by sort of delineating the different microhabitats and plant communities that were already there. So we went around and did inventories, and I want to thank my mentor, Ruth Defoe, who led us in this exercise. And we determined that, for example, in the roadside garden, which is an overgrown perennial bed, we had leftover perennials, non-native perennials. We had European grasses, we had Queen Anne's lace and chicory, but we also had some native plants like the white beard tongue and brown-eyed Susan, which we wanted to keep. And so we determined which plant community we thought was the most appropriate for that area, and then set about trying to eliminate more or less whom we didn't want to have and bringing in whom we wanted to have. And we basically created a native meadow along that edge of the road. We had a honey locust tree with an overgrown perennial bed that lent itself to become a shade garden where we invited native forest plants, ferns, sedges, wild ginger, all sorts of interesting things to thrive in the shade of that tree. We discovered some rocks in the overgrown lawn and created a little rock garden and invited some plants in that we had seen growing around rocky outcrops in wilder areas like the wild columbine and little blue stem. And then we went a little bit further and became a little bit more impactful by deciding that we actually wanted to have a rain garden. There wasn't really any wet area on that land. And we had the opportunity here with the help of the farmers and their machinery to actually dig out a hole, fill it with topsoil and make it into an area where the runoff of the parking lot would go. And we planted it with native wet meadow plants. So that's sort of a little bit the philosophy of, try to see what you have and support who is there already, and then modify what you feel is still needed. In general, we encourage you to encourage and plant native plants. And why is that? Well, I should give a shout out to Douglas Tallamy, who with his 2007 presentation, Bringing Nature Home, with his book, really did a tremendous job of promoting the idea how important it is to have native plants in our backyards and gardens, and how much difference we can make in conserving native biodiversity just on our small lots. And the reason for that is that many native herbivorous insects can only thrive on native plants. They're not used to eating the introduced plants, which have chemicals they are not equipped to digest. And maybe you don't need this reminder, but we all should remember that the beautiful butterflies that fly around, most of them, and also the moths, most of them start their life as herbivorous caterpillars who need to eat leaves. And here's the example of the Baltimore checker spot, whose caterpillars need to eat the leaves of turtlehead. So, and then herbivorous insects are a crucial part of the food web. So Conrad already showed us the great tangle of life. And insects feed predatory insects, they feed birds, they feed bats. And again, Douglas Tallamy did a nice study basically telling how many caterpillars does a pair of chickadees bring to their brood in order to raise one nest full of chicks. And it's in the thousands. So those herbivorous insects are very important for some of the more charismatic animals that we would like to attract to our yards. Another suggestion is to encourage diversity and anticipate and tolerate change in your garden. This is a little bit of a longer section, and I'll start by saying diversity helps with resilience to extreme weather and to the herbivory, which we are hoping you will tolerate somewhat in your garden. If you have a lot of different species of plants, then that particularly dry summer or that particularly wet summer is going to favor some over others, but somebody is going to be there thriving. And if you have the native insects coming in and you have a lot of different plants, then hopefully a lot of different insects will come and eat a little bit of a lot of different plants, as opposed to you having just one type of plant and a lot of insects come in and eat a lot of that one plant. Diversity also ensures a variety of resources. And here I want to go a little bit deeper into our native meadows study that we have been conducting at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub since 2017. And I want to give a shout out to my mentor, Kelly Gill from the Xerxes Society, who has helped us design and execute that study. Basically, what we've done is we have 3 sets of 3 half-acre plots that were seeded with 2 different seed mixes, and the 3rd plot was not seeded and was allowed to develop as a fallow field just the way it wants to develop. And we're documenting the development of the composition of the vegetation and also the insects that are attracted to those different types of meadows. And these are the seed mixes. Mix A was a species-rich seed mix, and mix B was not so rich and flower-rich, Conrad says. Well, also species-rich. And if you want to see those seed mixes, they are given in our resource page. So there's a link to our website where you can find them. And one component of diversity, of thinking about diversity, is that what you seed is only sort of what you get. So you have to anticipate change. So these 2 pie charts show the composition of seeds that we seeded into the meadows, into 3 of those plots with a wildflower-rich seed mix in 2017. And this is the composition of the resulting vegetation 4 years later. And what you see is that 8 species that made up only 36% of the seeds are actually 4 years later making up 88% of the plants in the respective plots. And those 8 most successful species are circled here in red. They include landsleaf coreopsis, partridge pea, wild bergamot, showy goldenrod, black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, New England aster, and early goldenrod. And those are the same species that also in our creek house garden are doing really well. So those seem to be well adapted to the conditions of the Hudson Valley and thrive if you just throw the seeds on the ground. And then if one looks a little bit more closely at the development of the vegetation in those native meadow trials, the height of the columns here is indicative of how the percentage of vegetation in our test plots on average that's covered by seeded species. So you can see that, and on the horizontal axis, you have the years, and the different colors within the column represent different species. So one thing you can see is that it does take those native meadows a few years to actually fill in. The seeds are not producing 100% vegetation cover the first year. They only produced 12%. The rest was weeds and bare ground. What you can also see is that the composition of the plants changes over time. So black-eyed Susan and landsleaf coreopsis were a big component during the second year of the meadows, but then they diminished as the meadow matured, and wild bergamot and the asters and goldenrods came in more strongly. So that's one component of diversity, that it actually changes over time. And we've also seen that in our garden at the Creek House, that some native plants you could almost think of as thugs that are actually just spreading and pushing out everybody else. And in our experience, wild bergamot and also the New England aster and some of the goldenrods can do that, while other native plants are not very long-lived. And so maintaining native plant diversity actually does require some maintenance. While gardening with native plants might be less work intensive than if you work only with cultivars, it's not without any work related if you want to maintain diversity. And so here are just 2 examples. The butterfly milkweed, which a few years back was beautiful and seemed to be thriving in our garden, has all but disappeared because it was overgrown by wild bergamot and the New England aster. And the cardinal flower is notoriously known for not living very long and disappearing if other plants are allowed to crowd in on it. And that makes total sense when you think about the natural habitat where cardinal flower grows, which is along rivers, the disturbed sandy shores of rivers. It relies on a certain degree of disturbance to create bare soil so that its seeds can germinate again, and population is maintained. And so as a gardener, one actually has to maintain some sort of disturbance around the cardinal flowers if one wants to keep those around. And not only does the diversity change over time, coming back to our native meadow trials, remember we seeded 3 half-acre plots with the same seed mix. And these are similar histograms for the 3 different plots that have been seeded with the same seed mix, the first year, second year, third year, and fourth year. And you can see that there was also variation in space. So each plot actually resulted in a slightly different composition of plants, even though the same seeds were planted initially. So there is variation from site to site as well. And then I just want to talk a little bit about why diversity is also important, because different insects are attracted to different flowers. So wild bergamot has a relatively deep flower tube in its flower head. It has many deep flower tubes in its flower head, and the nectar is hidden far down. And It's mostly long-tongued insects such as butterflies, moths, and bumblebees that are attracted to those deep flowers. Similarly, with the black-eyed Susan, you might be aware of the fact that the actual flowers are only sitting in this cone in the center, and it's actually an accumulation of, again, deep tubed flowers that hide the nectar deep down. Again, it's butterflies and bumblebees that are mostly attracted to black-eyed Susan, although some smaller insects might come and just eat the pollen, which is exposed at the top and easily accessible. Now, a totally different flower design is Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot, which has very shallow flowers and allows insects, small insects with short tongues, to access the nectar. And here's where you find a lot of the hoverflies, and you find wasps of all sizes. So diversity is important because different insects need different morphologies of flowers. And this is a study that a student from SUNY Albany, Erin Allen, did with us in 2018. She went into our native meadow trials at the Farm Hub and did visual surveys of the insects that she found on flowers. And so within the same meadow, bumblebees, she observed 551 bumblebees, selected black-eyed Susan, the wild bergamot and New England aster, and a bunch of other seeded plants to visit the flowers of. And they visited very little the flowers that we had not seeded, which were red clover and white clover and vetch. So it became clear to us during this exercise that yes, we had created beautiful wildflower meadows with our seeding, but we were attracting mostly the long-tongued insects like bumblebees and butterflies. And in Erin's survey of the wasps, in the same meadow setup, they also came to black-eyed Susan and a little bit to some of the other plants we had seeded, but mostly they visited plants that were wild growing and had small open flowers that were easily accessible for the wasps. And just to bring home the point that wasps are not just yellow jackets. Yellow jackets are wasps, but there's a range of usually much, much smaller wasps of all sorts of different shapes and sizes. This little circle is actually the size of a penny, so it gives you an idea. Some of those wasps are really, really tiny. And many of them are considered beneficial insects because their larvae eat sometimes pests and sometimes other insects. Diversity also provides resources throughout the year. So when you go on the internet, you can find a lot of these types of charts that sort of show the flowering times throughout the season of different native wildflowers. I also want to give a brief shout out for two wonderful books, which we have listed in the resource list, that also give information about flowering time of different wildflowers, but also which insects exactly are being attracted to them, and also give identification help for the insects that you might find on your flowers in your yard. So while these charts are useful and generally give you an idea of who comes first and who comes last, again, looking in a little bit more detail at our native meadow trial at the Farm Hub, we learned that each year, again, is different. And when you look at the flower abundance in 2019, the peak of flowering was in mid-August. And then the year later, the peak of flowering was 3 weeks earlier. However, the sequence of flowering was Landsleaf coreopsis coming first, black-eyed Susan coming next, the wild bergamot coming after that, and then the asters and goldenrods coming in the fall. That held. But there is variation from year to year, so don't expect your garden to look the same every year. Diversity also can provide food and shelter in winter. And that is important because a lot of our insects overwinter in, you know, messy looking vegetation, in hollow stalks of plants. And a lot of the birds that stick around in the winter love to eat the seeds of those asters and goldenrods that are continue standing into the winter. So one suggestion for attracting more life to your yard, or to support more life in your garden, is to leave it standing a little bit messy into the winter. Don't rake up all your leaves. A lot of insects overwinter in leaf litter. And don't do your spring cleanup too early either. So give those creatures time to emerge. And this is some of the data. Our insect team at the Farmscape Ecology program, every spring, they put out these little tents, which basically are designed to catch the insects that emerge from the ground and from the vegetation that's covered by the tent in spring. And within over 1 month, one of those approximately 4 square foot emergence traps has caught 156 different creatures. And here's the listing of who all was hiding in that small piece of ground and the vegetation that was covered up. So you can get an idea of how much life is emerging right now out of the ground and out of old vegetation. The final big, well, it's not very big, but I want to encourage you to start thinking creatively about your lawn. You can modify your lawn by, if you still are using pesticides, just stop using pesticides. Your lawn does not need to be this pristine, just green, grassy area. If you allow some dandelions to come in, you provide so much resources to insects. Same with the white clover that will readily grow in your lawn if you stop using herbicides. Another possibility is to change the frequency of mowing. Find a corner in your yard where you don't really need to have this closely mowed lawn, and allow some more flowers to develop. You might even consider reducing the area of your lawn, and you can do that either by wholesale conversion, tilling it up and seeding it with something else, like creating a wildflower meadow, or you can take a more low-key approach, as we did in the Creek House garden. We had a lawn area under some fruit trees that we discontinued mowing. We watched to see who was coming up. We weeded out the invasives like the spotted knapweed that wanted to come in. And then we just created little holes and transplanted wildflowers, native wildflowers from other parts in the garden, to create eventually a wildflower meadow out of our lawn. And then there's also the possibility to reduce your lawn little by little around the edges, or to create islands of perennials inside the lawn. And one true and tight method for that is use your black plastic, which doesn't look pretty, but it does the job. Leave it on there for a season, kill the grass, work through the soil and take out whatever grass roots are still in there, cover it up with cardboard, make holes in the cardboard, plant your perennials, put some mulch on top, and you have a new area of perennial garden that you could manage as a perennial garden. Or if you take a more hands-off approach, you can let it develop into a meadow composed of native plants. So some people might say, yeah, that all sounds nice and good, but my neighbors are not going to like it, or I'm tied into a neighborhood association agreement that requires certain things to happen in my lawn. And I want to point you to the excellent website of BCT USA, which has some really good practical suggestions how to deal with those concerns. And one of them is just make sure to put up a sign that shows your intention with what you're doing in your garden. Show people that there that it's not neglected, but that it's a conscious choice, and you might even have some interesting conversations with your neighbors and passerbys around that. I just want to remind you, as Conrad has shown, lights can be a huge problem for moths and lightning bugs. So please turn off those unnecessary outside lights at night. You will help the night flying insects a lot. And my parting thought is, consider gardening as a journey that allows for observation, adaptation of expectations, and appreciation of the unexpected, rather than an exercise in control that leads to a predetermined endpoint. I think you can have a lot of joy with that if you take that approach and avoid some frustration. And then my final thoughts are, don't feel like you have to do it all. Every little bit helps. Take time to observe and get to know the other than human life in your garden, and try to support and enrich what is already there. And that is the end of our presentation. And we want to thank you for your attention, and hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the day out in your gardens.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia and Conrad. That was wonderful. That was packed with information. And I know that the resource guide you sent is packed with information too. So I encourage, Ryan emailed everybody that file. So definitely check that and go through that. I know for me, you had that picture of the turtle head and the checker spot, was it?
Mm-hmm.
I remember my first season here, I had never seen a plant just being devoured in our rain garden. And so my first instinct was, you know, I have to do something. But of course I knew enough to like check that urge, but I really had the urge, you know, am I gonna squish them? Am I gonna spray them? What like organic spray can I use to save the turtle head? And then I looked it up in a book and I was like, oh, these look exactly like the larvae that need turtle head. That's like that relationship. And so then I was happy, and turtle head is a very tough plant. We have plenty of turtle head. So it turned from fear into total joy. So those resources, just check yourself before you do something and find out what you're actually seeing, because it may be exactly what you want. We're getting thank yous. And I have a question. If you have a narrow strip of land to develop as a pollinator garden, are there plant species you would recommend? That's a good question.
Well, I think you need to consider how sunny it is, what your soil is. Is it moist soil? Is it sandy soil? Yeah, so I think if you want to have it easy and have a pretty good chance at success, taking any one of my 8 species that have been doing very well at the Farm Hub is gonna give you success. So the black-eyed Susan, the wild bergamot, the purple coneflower, lanceleaf coreopsis, New England aster. Depends a little bit if you have a lot of deer pressure, that might get eaten by deer. But if it's not in a deer-prone area, the New England aster is wonderful. Showy goldenrod is wonderful. So I think those are sort of pretty versatile plants that should do well in a lot of different soil conditions, as long as there's some sun. They probably wouldn't do well in shade.
So then the next question, leading to the next question, how about a shady, dry health strip?
A shady what strip?
A shady, dry health strip. Joe, what would you say? What do you mean by a health strip? Nothing grows there?
Oh, health strip. Shady, dry health strip. Yeah, good question.
I have one plant. I
Which
don't know how
one?
good it is for insects, but Ridgeron Tolchelis, which is a flea bane,
Mhm.
and we use a cultivar here a lot called Lynn Haven Carpet, and it does very well in dry shade and among plants that like surface rooted trees, like firs and stuff.
Right. Yeah, you
and
can
it-
try
it's
that,
like a-
and the flea banes are actually good for the small pollinators. They won't attract big showy butterflies and bumblebees, but a lot of the smaller native bees and the wasps will come to flea bane. Yeah, that's a good idea.
anything else?
I don't have much experience with shady areas.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I kn- what is it? The aster, the other aster, the white wood aster. I think it might do well in that. It's a pretty tough plant.
Yeah, whitewood aster, and yeah, you're right, and maybe even the hard-leafed aster, the blue wood aster.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So then you have spring, then you got spring and fall blooms. There you go. I have a question about the lights at night.
You can take that.
Is there, how do you talk to neighbors about that? What's a good way to talk to neighbors? And is there, I think there are different different colors that might be better.
Yeah, I don't know the color questions, and I think one approach that's sort of a compromise is that you can kind of shade the lights a little bit. So if your goal is really to make sure you can see your backyard and you feel you need that, then by putting some sort of a cover over the lights, at least you're not projecting the light upward and outward to a much larger area, and so attracting insects from a much larger range. So something like that, where you say, maybe I understand you need a light, but do you mind not shining it in my backyard and here are maybe some examples, and you can find these online, examples of lights that have certain canopies or something on them, or more downward facing. There might be something about color I don't really know in terms of attracting insects.
Somebody wrote, Ryan wrote, he turned all his outdoor lights into motion sensors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a start.
Mhm. I think that's it. If anybody has a question, type it now or send it to me. I can always pass it on to Claudia and Conrad.
Our email is also on the resource list. So if anybody wants to follow up with questions, we're happy to receive emails.
Great. And thank you so much. And really, thank you for all the work that you've done here and for all the amazing work that you're doing for our community and our world. It's really, really important, and it's very appreciated.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for inviting us to share.
Everybody get out there and look for the early hair streak and other butterflies, bumblebees, wasps, ants.
I mean, looking out the window today, I see that the spiders are ballooning. So there are all these strands of gossamer on our trees. So if you get out there, it's really a lively day in the insect world, well, in the invertebrate world.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy your weekend.
You too.